first thing, obviously, nothing in this presentation should be construed as legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. So, first question: do you need a CMP? Well, pretty much the answer is yes. You do need a CMP. They deal with a complicated and important problem for you in a cost-effective way, and I think it's just not realistic for many very few organizations would have the technical capabilities to build a fully compliant digital presence without using a third-party technology stack like a CMP. So it really is it is time to get one if you don't have one. I should say on the compliance side, you might take a view, well, we're some small niche company, I can still take a risk around compliance. I don't think that's a very sensible or comfortable course of action, but also just from experience, even some of our clients, even some very low profile, inconspicuous businesses, have already encountered legal problems because of issues with compliance. So I think you have to do something about this now, and a CMP is the obvious way to go. So what does a CMP do for you? So what we've got here on the left-hand side, a user is using a device and a browser on that device to interact with your website. You've got a cookie warning or a compliance notice, a consent notice that users have to interact with when they come to your site, and where you try to get that consent. You have to have some documentation around your privacy and your use of cookies, your use of tracking code. So you need a policy doc. And then your website itself, the web server will read and set server cookies. And then what tends to be the highest profile consideration is you'll almost certainly be using some third-party tools. You'll be using Google Analytics, or you'll be using a plugin to handle live chat, and those will read and write cookies as well. And so they are subject to privacy legislation and need to be made compliant. And then it's quite likely that you might be using a tag manager such as Google Tag Manager to manage at least some of those third-party tools as well. So what I've tried to do here is overlay in red what a CMP is going to do for you, what a consent management platform is going to do for you. And you can see it touches quite a lot of bits of this system. So the conspicuous thing, the sort of obvious thing, that the CMP is going to provide the consent banner, the cookie warning that the user interacts with, and it's going to manage the process of the user providing or withdrawing or not providing consent. Your CMP also is going to help you with your cookie policy by providing the documentation that you need to provide to be compliant about what cookies you are using on your site and what the purposes are. And then the padlock icons here, your CMP is going to provide control mechanisms so that the things in your tech stack that read and write cookies are controlled in compliance with the user's consent settings. So the CMP provides the framework that controls all of that. And then at the bottom of this diagram, most importantly, there needs to be an auditing capability. So I'm going to use this framework to take us through the considerations that you might apply when choosing a CMP. And I'm going to start by looking at the user experience considerations. So what I mean by that is the consent banner that a user interacts with when they come to your website. That's going to be provided and managed by your CMP. What are some of the things you should think of there? And I always think with user experience, it is useful to, it's important to look at user experience in the context of real user journeys. So by way of a few examples, I just recorded something of me trying to go through something that approximates a real user journey. So the first consent banner I see is Google's. And you can see this is a very conspicuous and intrusive consent banner. So I'm gonna accept Google's consent so that I can go on a bit further. So here's the first one I looked at. So this is Rightmove, and this is kind of very similar to Google. This is very strongly modal. The page behind is grayed out. Actually, interesting. There is a little difference because that page behind is still interactive, but otherwise I can't go any further on that page without interacting with the modal dialog. Here's a second example. This is very different, and actually you'd be forgiven for just missing the cookie banner here altogether. It's not that big. It's not modal. It's in brand colors and with a very sort of branded look and feel. And you can see I can completely interact with that page without without interacting with the consent banner in any way. I should say I'm not showing any of these examples as best practice, and for sure some of these examples are not compliant. So I'm not saying you should copy these. I'm just using them as examples of the different approaches that we might take. Here's a different one, which is sort of intermediate between the two. The page is grayed out a bit, but I can interact with it. So it's a sort of compromise between the two approaches that we saw there. And then I have one more example at the end here. Very inconspicuous cookie banner, doesn't get in the way of anything, and that's up to me whether I interact with it or not. So some very different approaches there. Then let's think about why those different approaches might be appropriate or not appropriate. You know, if I'm Google, you know, everybody knows Google. Everybody knows that Google offers an extremely useful user experience. You know, I know the Google search engine is going to be really helpful to me and actually essential to this particular user journey. You know, I'm here to use Google to find information. So I have no choice other than to interact with this consent banner. And I'm not going to go anywhere else. You know, I might be annoyed by this or frustrated, but I can't take my business elsewhere because there is only one Google search engine. So for Google to make a choice of, you know, kind of forcing me to interact with the consent banner makes perfect sense to Google. Google's not going to lose any customers because they put this very intrusive modal interaction in the way of the search engine. Arguably, the same is probably true of Rightmove. You know, Rightmove, it's a well-known brand. You know, there aren't many listing sites that are as comprehensive as Rightmove. So I'm probably, you know, quite strongly motivated to go through the consent banner. I'm not going to be annoyed by it enough to go, oh, I can't be bothered to go to the Rightmove website. I'm going to go back to someone else's. But for some of these other sites that I visited, that might not be as true. You know, maybe I want to go to the Savills site. I don't know the brand as well. If Savills gave me a strongly modal dialogue before I could interact with the site, that might be a barrier. So it could be that a modal banner here would reduce the conversion rate of this site. So there might, you know, there are different reasons for using different styles of consent banner. There are pros and cons to all of those approaches, I think. And then the kind of big choice, you know, do you want a really intrusive modal banner that forces interaction before anyone can get to the rest of your site? You've got the best chance of obtaining a consent, or at least obtaining a consent preference from the user. But you've also got the best chance of driving them away because you've annoyed them. And that's going to reduce the conversion rate. There isn't one right approach. You might have some pages on your site where you want to take one of those approaches and some pages where you want to take another approach. You might have some traffic sources where you want to take one approach and some where you want to take another approach. So the best thing a CMP can do is to offer you some flexibility about the look and feel and the user experience of those consent dialogues. Second thing I want to talk about is is the control mechanisms. So just a reminder, my overview of a CMP. So now we're zooming in on this part of the system. You know, you've interacted with your user to get consent. You understand their consent state, and now the tags that read and write cookies need to allowed to proceed or not, depending on that consent state. Basically, three different ways of managing that control process within a CMP. So the first is, I'm going to call it manual. In other words, the CMP doesn't impose any control at all, but you or your developers can write code, and there'll be an API or multiple APIs of some sort, so that you can query the consent state of the user and you can change the behavior of your site accordingly. So this is a developer task, okay, but it's in some cases this is what you may need to do. The second approach is what's usually called script blocking. So this is a CMP provides some fancy JavaScript that interferes with all the other JavaScript on your site and just means it doesn't run unless consent has been given. Everything that needs consent is blocked by default, and it's only enabled when the CMP recognizes that that consent has been granted. I have really mixed feelings about script blocking. It does have a place, but it's a pretty crude weapon. It's a kind of sledgehammer approach. And it doesn't actually block everything. If it blocks scripts, as the name suggests. So if you're reading and writing cookies server side, script blocking can't do anything about that. You've still got to use another solution. And then a third approach to control is to use an integration with Tag Manager and with a Tag Manager, which is very often going to be Google Tag Manager. So these are sort of three different ways of achieving, allowing the CMP to control the compliance sensitive functionality of your tech stack. So one thing I would say here is if maybe you're looking to implement a CMP, you don't have tag management yet, but you're thinking about getting it, or you have a sort of incomplete tag management implementation. I think it's a really good idea to just look at these three things together. They do interact very strongly. Anyway, back to those different control modes that the CMP provides. Truth is, in most tech stacks, you are going to need to use more than one of those. You might use script blocking for some things. You might use tag manager integration. You might have to use an API for some functionality that just doesn't. So again, look for flexibility there. A good CMP should support all of those methods. Something I really like, and lots of credit to Cookiebot for having this. Script blocking is a very blunt weapon, but selective script blocking is great. So sometimes script blocking really is the thing that you want to use. And in some CMPs, including Cookiebot, you can say, I want script blocking to block some things, but I don't want it to get in the way of other things because I'm going to manage those via Google Tag Manager. I'm going to manage those via the API. Third aspect of the system, I said a CMP helps you with your cookie documentation, your privacy documentation. In some jurisdictions, in order to be fully compliant, you need to provide excruciating detail about what cookies you are using and what the purposes for using those cookies is. And you really do not want to have to do that yourself. It's almost an impossible job because of the technical complexity, and it's certainly an extremely dull and unrewarding job. A CMP should do this for you automatically. Consider things like, do you need multiple language support? And also consider, a kind of related but different point, do you need actually different policies in different locales? Next thing I want to talk about as I said at the beginning, the auditing capability of the CMP is really important. When you are initially implementing a CMP, if the audit tool is good, it will help you identify all the things on your site that are causing compliance problems, all the things that read and write cookies, and it'll help you figure out and map out what strategies you're going to use. You're going to use script blocking, you're going to put them in Tag Manager. But the audit tool kind of creates your to-do list for your route to compliance as you implement your CMP. The other things to remember, however careful you are, something will slip through. And then even if you catch absolutely everything in the implementation, things will change. A user comes along later on and they create some piece of content that embeds a third-party media player, say that you haven't used before, and that raises a compliance issue. So one way or another, you're going to miss some things and you're going to end up being non-compliant. With most CMPs, you can try out the audit capabilities, and this is certainly true with Cookiebot. The audit tool in Cookiebot is really strong in my view, and you can sign up for a free trial with Cookiebot and try out the audit tool.